On a black December night in 1939, on a frozen hill above the Kollaa River in eastern Finland, 32 men were waiting in log bunkers for 3,000. That, at least, is the number that has come down to us, and will come back to where it came from. The ground was frozen too hard to dig, so they had built above it instead, stacking logs and packing the walls with snow because snow holds heat when earth will not. Out past the tree line, in the dark, an entire Soviet Red Army rifle regiment was forming up to take this one hill. The temperature sat somewhere past 20 below. Nobody talked. What those 32 men did not know was that the shape of the next 100 days was about to be set right here, on this slope, in the next few hours. But how does a force that small hold ground at all? What happened on the line when the tactic that kept them alive finally stopped working? And if the line was never broken, why did Finland give the ground away anyway? In this video, using Finnish and Soviet unit records, wartime accounts from the men who held the sector, and the modern terrain itself, we'll walk through the defense of Kollaa, from the first shot to the last hour of the Winter War, what the Finns call the talvisota. To do that, we need to understand the situation as it stood at the end of November 1939. On the 30th of November, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. 4 armies crossed the border at once, and the largest push, the one meant to finish the war in a fortnight, drove straight at the Karelian Isthmus toward Helsinki. But there was a second front that mattered just as much, running along the northern shore of Lake Ladoga. It's here that the Kollaa River cuts through the forest. Kollaa was not a town. It was barely a place at all. A river, some low ground, and a scatter of log roads through pine and birch. So why fight for it? Look at what sat behind it. Behind this line was a road running west, and behind that road was the open flank of every Finnish force holding the ground north of Ladoga. If Kollaa broke, the Soviets did not just take a stretch of forest. They took a road into the back of the whole northern front, and from there away around the Mannerheim line, the fortified defensive line further south, where the war was actually being decided. That's why this thin strip of frozen river ended up carrying more weight than its size suggests. Major General Valdemar Hägglund commanded the Finnish 4th Army Corps, responsible for the whole front north of Ladoga. The fighting on the ground here fell to the Finnish 12th Division. One division. That was the whole of what stood between the Soviet 8th Army and that road. And the 8th Army did not sit still. It opened with the 56th Rifle Division, which reached the east bank of the Kollaa River on the 7th of December. In the middle of January, the 164th arrived. On the 21st of February, the 75th was spotted moving through the forest to the north. 6 days after that, the 128th appeared in the forest to the south. 4 divisions fed into the same narrow stretch of trees, one at a time. Each one meant to be the one that finally went through. So the odds at Kollaa were not fixed. They got worse every week. A single Finnish division began this fight facing one Soviet division and ended it facing 4, with the last 2 arriving inside a single week. On paper, the situation deteriorated steadily from the first day to the last, and yet the ground did not move. So who were the men holding it? Let's meet a few. Lieutenant Arne Juutilainen commanded the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, and he had not arrived here by any ordinary route. From 1930 to 1935, he served in the French Foreign Legion, in Algeria and Morocco, fighting Berber rebels in the Atlas Mountains. He came home with a name that stuck to him for the rest of his life, the Terror of Morocco. He was not a staff officer. He was a man who had already spent 5 years fighting on another continent, and he brought that straight into this forest. His company built a reputation fast. The men under him were known as good shots and good skiers, and many were decorated for bravery before the fighting here had properly begun. his own regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Taitinen, put Juutilainen's contribution to Kollaa in 5 words. He created the Kollaa spirit. One of the riflemen in that same 6th company was a small, quiet farmer named Simo Haiha, who would become the most feared sniper of the war, known after the conflict as White Death. At Kollaa, though, he was one good shot in a company full of them, doing the same work in the same snow as everyone else on the line. Because the company did not run on any one man's reputation, it ran on the ground and on a method. So what was it about this ground that let a single division hold? Let's take a look. Stand on this stretch today and you see continuous forest, low ridges, and a river that hardly announces itself. In 1939, it looked much the same, and that is exactly the point. Dense pine and birch with almost no clear lines of sight. Frozen lakes and bogs that read as open ground on a map, but will not carry a column moving at speed. And running through all of it, one real road, wide enough for Soviet trucks, armor, and supply. That single road is the whole story of this battle. Take it away, and an army moves through snow that swallows a man to the waist. The Finns knew this ground because they lived in it, moved through it on skis, and understood what it would and would not carry. The Soviets came through it as though it were open country. It was not. That gap is what the Finns turned into a weapon, and the weapon had a name: motti. A motti, in plain terms, is a trap built by cutting a column into pieces. Finnish ski troops moving fast and quiet through terrain the Red Army could not follow would cross the road behind a column and sever it from the advance. Once a section was cut off, it was not stormed, it was surrounded. No frontal assault, no wasted men. The Finns closed the ring and waited, and the cold did the rest of the work. Freezing engines, freezing wounds, freezing men who could not light a fire without marking their own position. Piece by piece, a division strung out along one road became a chain of frozen pockets, each ground down from the outside. The same method was working simultaneously further north, at the Battle of Suomussalmi, where Finnish forces encircled and destroyed 2 entire Soviet divisions over roughly the same period. Kollaa was the holding action. Suomussalmi was what motti could do when it had room to run. It was in the middle of this stretch of fighting that Hägglund put a question to Juutilainen that would outlive the war. Will Kollaa hold? Juutilainen's answer came back flat and immediate. Kollaa will hold, unless the orders are to run away. That was the entire exchange. No speech, no elaboration. A question and an answer. Within weeks, every soldier in Finland knew the phrase. Let's just pause for a moment right here. This is a story with a great deal more detail in it than we can fit into a video this length, particularly on the Soviet side, where the unit records tell a very different story from the one usually told. If you want the fuller version, the sources are listed in the description. Anyway, back to the line. Because for a while, the method worked exactly as designed. Column after column was cut, surrounded, frozen out. But a tactic built to beat one road stops working the moment the enemy stops using one road. And that is precisely what the Soviets worked out. So what changed? Let's walk through the last 3 weeks. By late February, the 8th Army had stopped feeding men into the same trap. It widened its approach, pushing several columns forward across a broader front, instead of stacking everything onto a single axis. That one change dismantled the logic the motti depended on. You cannot cut off and starve an enemy who is no longer confined to a line. The forest that had been funneling Soviet troops into manageable pieces now simply had soldiers moving through it everywhere at once. Then the guns started. On the 2nd of March, 50 Soviet artillery batteries put somewhere between 30 and 40,000 shells onto the Finnish main line in a single day. That is not a bombardment aimed at a target. That is ground being erased, tree line by tree line, bunker by bunker, hour after hour with no let-up. Positions that had been held since December stopped existing as positions. 10 days later, on the 12th of March, the line finally tore. Soviet troops punched through a gap somewhere between half a kilometer and a kilometer and a half wide. For a front already stretched across miles of forest by a single division, a hole that size was close to fatal. There was no depth behind it, nothing to fall back onto, and nothing in reserve worth the name. Whatever came through that gap could walk to the road, and the road behind Kollaa was the same road that had made this place worth dying for since the first week of December. The Finnish command considered pulling back off the main line altogether, but word came up from the front that the situation on the ground was not as bad as it looked on the map. So instead of a withdrawal, the order went out for a counterattack the following day to retake what had been lost. Men who had been fighting for 96 consecutive days went back into that gap to close it by force, the same way they had closed every gap that winter, with less room for error and almost no time left on the clock. They never got to finish it, and they never had to. Word reached the front that a peace treaty had been signed. The Treaty of Moscow, signed on the 13th of March 1940, ended the Winter War. The counterattack was called off, and the men were told to hold exactly where they stood until the fighting officially stopped. The line at Kollaa was never broken. It was torn badly in its final week, and it held anyway, right up to the last hour of a war that had already been decided somewhere else, at a table, by men who had never been anywhere near this forest. Which brings us to the version of this story most people have heard, and the one name attached to all of it. In the popular telling, Kollaa held because of one impossibly gifted sniper, and the phrase Kollaa Kesta is treated as something that grew out of Simo Haiha's kill count. But in reality, the phrase belongs to two other men entirely. Haiha served in Utilainen's company and fought here like every other rifleman in that unit. But the words came from Hägglund's question and Utilainen's answer, spoken and repeated through the ranks weeks before Haiha's reputation had traveled beyond his own company. While it is true that the sector became far better known after the war partly because of Haiha's fame, and that is fair enough, fame after the fact is not the same as origin. The phrase came from a general asking a direct question and a lieutenant giving him a direct answer. Nothing about a rifle, nothing about a body count. Which brings us back to those 32 men on the hill. That number is the most repeated fact about this battle. It appears everywhere, usually with the same figures attached. 32 Finns in a fortified position, a full Soviet regiment sent against them, 400 Soviet dead, and 4 Finns still alive at the end of it. The position even has a name in the accounts, Killer Hill. But in reality, nobody who repeats those numbers ever says where they came from. There is no date attached to them, no regiment named on either side, no commander, and no document cited. And here is the part that should give you pause. Killer Hill does not appear in the Finnish accounts of this battle at all. Not in the Finnish encyclopedia entry for Kollaa, which names the divisions and dates them one by one. Not in the histories written by the veterans' associations of the regiments that were actually there. The most famous engagement of this battle, in English, is absent from the record in the language of the men who supposedly fought it. What has happened instead is that the newer English retellings have started inventing the missing details to fill the hole. One will tell you it happened on the 17th of December against the 75th Rifle Division, a formation that Finnish records place at Kollaa for the first time on the 21st of February, more than 2 months later. Another says the number comes from a telegram of the 28th of December, recording who was left after a withdrawal, which would make it a head count rather than a last stand. Neither can point to a document. That does not mean nothing happened on that hill. Small groups held impossible frontages all over this sector, and that is precisely why the story is believable. But the single most quoted number in this battle is the one part of it standing on nothing, while the parts nobody quotes are the parts you can actually check. The man at the center of the legend had a family who watched it grow. Utilainen's nephew Olavi said of him, decades later, that his uncle was undeniably a fearless soldier, but that a previously too romanticized image of him had been painted. That is a relative of the hero, saying the quiet part out loud. The Kollaa story does not need the decoration. What is documented is remarkable enough, because what is not in dispute is the arithmetic of the sector. Roughly 1,500 Finns dead or wounded. Roughly 8,000 on the Soviet side. 97 days, 4 divisions, and ground that never changed hands. So how does a force that small hold ground at all? By refusing to fight the battle, the enemy came to fight, and by using terrain and cold as weapons in their own right for as long as the enemy allowed it. What happened when the tactic stopped working? The line was very nearly lost in 72 hours and was saved by a counterattack that the armistice made unnecessary before it began. And why did Finland give the ground away anyway? Because Kollaa was one sector in a war being lost elsewhere, and the Treaty of Moscow took no account of which lines had broken and which had not. The men who held this sector were given a commemorative cross afterwards, named for the place, the Kollaa Cross, a decoration named for ground that Finland no longer owned by the time it was awarded. The man who gave the sector its phrase did not do well out of it. Arne Utilainen fought on through the continuation war. The second conflict with the Soviet Union that followed just over a year later, and afterwards came apart. He drank. He took whatever work he could find in Helsinki. He died alone in a nursing home in 1976, age 72, more than 30 years after the winter that made him a national figure. The phrase outlasted him by a long way. Today that ground lies inside Russia, on the far side of a border drawn by the treaty, and most of the men who held it never saw it again. The museum that tells their story stands more than 100 kilometers away on the Finnish side at Rautjärvi, near the village where Haiha was born. On the Russian side, out in the Karelian forest, a memorial called the Cross of Sorrow stands for the dead of both armies, most of whom are still where they fell. The forest has grown back over the bunker lines. The river runs the same way it did, and the phrase those men left behind is still in the language, spoken by Finns who have never seen the place it came from. For more stories from the Winter War and the men who fought it, make sure you're subscribed to the channel.